Welcome back to the briefing. There is a weight that defines the difference between a negotiable military operation and an inevitable radioactive catastrophe, and that weight is 972 pounds. 972 pounds of 60% enriched uranium that Iran stores in deep underground bunkers, and that the United States plans to physically extract via a JSOC operation. 440 kilograms. When you transport highly radioactive uranium hexafluoride in an active combat zone, the smallest mistake doesn't produce a mission failure. It produces massive regional radioactive contamination that turns the area into a dead zone for decades. Let that sink in, because this is not about unbounded military ambition. It is an admission that 3 weeks of bombing did not degrade Iranian capabilities enough to force a surrender. When a massive air campaign fails, 2 options remain: withdraw, admitting defeat, or escalate to an operation so risky that commanders describe it as nearly impossible. The United States chose to escalate. Iran responded with 6 conditions that permanently eliminate the American presence from the Middle East and transfer control of Hormuz. 6 conditions not designed to be accepted, designed to demonstrate that Iran dictates the terms of American withdrawal. Stay with me, because this is not about drones paralyzing Ben Gurion. It is about the convergence of 3 strategic failures where every available option produces a worse outcome than admitting defeat. Bombing did not degrade Iranian capabilities. Israeli logistics now depend on ground transport because Ben Gurion is under constant attack. The only remaining military option requires extracting radioactive material from deep bunkers with the risk of an environmental catastrophe. Iran launched Arash-2 drones against Ben Gurion. The Arash-2 has a range of 2,000 kilometers, flies low to avoid radar, has an extremely small signature, and is mass-produced domestically. Iran replaces losses faster than Israel can intercept them. When a drone swarm saturates defenses designed for high-value threats, the mathematics collapse. Every intercepted Arash-2 consumes a missile that costs 100 times more. When the drones keep coming after the inventory is depleted, the defense collapses. Ben Gurion hit, fuel facilities damaged, refueling network compromised, 3 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Ben Gurion is the logistics hub that supports Israeli Air Force operations. When fuel is hit, planes cannot refuel efficiently. When planes are destroyed on the ground, the sortie rate drops. Israel faces moving logistics out of Ben Gurion, or accepting a continuous degradation of capacity under a threat it cannot eliminate. Iran stores 972 pounds of 60% enriched uranium. Weapons grade requires 90%, but the technical distance from 60 to 90 is a fraction of the distance from 0 to 60. 440 kilograms is enough for multiple devices. It is stored in underground bunkers designed to withstand aerial bombardment. International Atomic Energy Agency Director Rafael Grossi described extracting it as an extraordinarily difficult task, even for the most advanced armies. Extraordinarily difficult is diplomatic language for nearly impossible. When the head of the organization that monitors nuclear material says an operation is extraordinarily difficult, he is saying the risk of catastrophic failure exceeds the probability of success. A catastrophic failure with 972 pounds of hexafluoride doesn't mean a failed mission. It means a radioactive release that contaminates the region for decades. It means a dirty bomb on a scale that makes the area uninhabitable. Iran presented 6 conditions for a ceasefire: closure of all U.S. military bases from the Gulf to Iraq, war reparations, a new legal regime for Hormuz that eliminates Western naval hegemony. These are not negotiable conditions. They are the demands of a country that believes it holds the strategic advantage and will continue the war until the adversary accepts terms that Washington considers surrender. The Strait of Hormuz transports 20% of the global oil supply. When Iran proposes a new legal regime, it is demanding the control that allows it to determine which vessels transit, under what terms, and at what cost. When a country controls 20% of global oil, it can influence prices, coerce dependent economies, and use access as a political weapon. Transferring that control to Iran is not a minor concession. It is an admission that the United States can no longer project naval power in the most strategic region for global energy. The closure of bases from the Gulf to Iraq means that U.S. forces withdraw from a region where they have operated for decades. It means that allies who depended on American security guarantees must recalibrate their foreign policies. It means that Israel is left without U.S. military backing in a region where it faces adversaries that Iran supports. And it means that any future crisis in the Middle East occurs without the American capability to deploy forces quickly from regional bases. That is the elimination of the American presence in the Middle East, not a reduction, elimination. The United States faces an impossible choice. Option 1. Accept the 6 Iranian conditions that eliminate the American presence from the Middle East and admit the most significant strategic defeat since Vietnam. Option 2. Reject the conditions and launch a JSOC ground operation to extract 972 pounds of enriched uranium from deep bunkers with the risk of releasing regional radioactive contamination. Option 3. Continue a bombing campaign that has already failed to degrade Iranian capabilities while the economic and political costs of the war continue to mount with no decisive outcome in sight. Rafael Grossi did not describe the operation as extraordinarily difficult for political reasons. He described the technical reality of attempting to secure uranium hexafluoride in bunkers designed to withstand nuclear attacks while under fire. Uranium hexafluoride reacts violently with moisture. When exposed to air, it forms hydrofluoric acid that corrodes lung tissue, and it is highly radioactive. Transporting 440 kilograms of that material out of a deep bunker, through a combat zone, and out of Iranian territory without causing a release requires conditions that do not exist in an active war. It requires total control of the airspace. It requires secured exfiltration routes. It requires specialized containers that protect against rupture, and it requires that no attacker hits the convoy during extraction, because a single impact could breach the containers and release the material. If a release occurs, radioactive contamination does not respect borders. The wind carries radioactive particles to Gulf countries where U.S. bases operate. Groundwater carries contamination to aquifers that millions rely on for drinking water, and the directly affected area becomes uninhabitable for decades. When you create a radioactive dead zone in a region where multiple countries operate in close proximity, you do not produce a tactical victory. You produce a humanitarian crisis that justifies international intervention against the country that caused the release, and that country would be the United States. Israel is now moving military logistics to ground transport because Ben Gurion cannot operate reliably under a persistent drone threat. Ground transport is orders of magnitude slower than air transport. Trucks carrying munitions and supplies are vulnerable to attacks en route, and Israeli rail capacity is a fraction of its air transport capacity. When armed forces designed to rely on air superiority and rapid air logistics lose reliable access to their main air hub, they must rebuild their entire logistics chain around ground transport that is slower, more vulnerable, and more expensive. Arash-2 drone swarms demonstrate perfect economic asymmetry. Iran produces each Arash-2 domestically for a fraction of the cost of the interceptor missile that Israel must use to shoot it down. When an attacker can produce threats faster and cheaper than the defender can intercept them, the defender eventually exhausts its interceptor inventory or accepts that some attacks will penetrate the defenses. Israel faces exactly that calculus right now. Every Arash-2 drone swarm forces a choice between expending expensive interceptors or allowing some drones to reach their targets. Neither option is sustainable in the long term. The closure of U.S. bases from the Gulf to Iraq eliminates NATO's capability to project power in the region. European allies who depend on American security guarantees to protect energy routes lose that protection. And Gulf countries that allowed U.S. bases on their territory must recalibrate relations with Iran, knowing that the United States can no longer provide them with military cover. When you withdraw all bases from a region, you don't reduce your presence. You eliminate your capability to respond to future crises because you don't have prepositioned deployment platforms. Iranian control of Hormuz affects not just the United States. It affects China, which imports oil through Hormuz. It affects India, which depends on Gulf energy. It affects Japan and South Korea, whose economies collapse without access to oil. When Iran controls 20% of the global oil supply, it can use access as a bargaining tool with every country that depends on that energy. It can offer favorable access to allies and restrict access to adversaries, and it can adjust prices by manipulating the flow. That is not regional resource control. It is control of the artery that the global economy requires to function. And here is the calculus that Washington faces. If you launch the JSOC operation and it fails, you have created a radioactive disaster that justifies international intervention and potentially sanctions against the United States for causing an environmental catastrophe. If you launch the operation and it succeeds in extracting the material but soldiers die in the process, you have paid a massive human cost for a tactical victory that does not change the strategic reality that Iran still controls Hormuz and can rebuild its nuclear program. If you accept the 6 Iranian conditions, you have admitted that Iran won the war and the United States withdraws from the region permanently. If you reject the conditions and continue bombing, you prolong a war that is already producing unsustainable economic costs without producing an Iranian collapse. Ben Gurion paralyzed by drone swarms that Israel cannot permanently eliminate. Israeli air logistics degraded. 972 pounds of enriched uranium in bunkers that aerial bombing cannot penetrate. The only option to remove the material requires a ground operation that the head of the IAEA describes as extraordinarily difficult, with the risk of a radioactive catastrophe. Iran presented 6 conditions that eliminate the American presence from the Middle East. Hormuz transports 20% of global oil. Control of Hormuz means control of global energy prices. Transferring that control to Iran permanently means the end of Western naval hegemony in the most strategically critical region. What happens when a massive bombing campaign fails to produce surrender? What happens when the only remaining military option requires extracting radioactive material from deep bunkers under enemy fire? What happens when the adversary presents conditions designed to permanently eliminate your regional presence? What happens when it controls 20% of the global oil supply? What happens when your allies depend on an airport that is under constant drone attack? What happens when the head of the IAEA says an operation is extraordinarily difficult? What happens when every available option produces a worse outcome than admitting defeat? You are in a war where strategic bombing failed, where allied logistics are degraded, where the only remaining military option risks a radioactive catastrophe, where the adversary dictates terms that eliminate your regional presence, where it controls the artery that transports 20% of global energy, where 972 pounds of radioactive material are in bunkers you cannot reach from the air, and where the only path to military victory requires a ground operation that can create an environmental disaster that no victory justifies. Washington chose to escalate. Iran chose to dictate terms. And now every option available to Washington produces a catastrophe of one kind or another. Or,